Hello and welcome to the Japan Politics podcast, and really I want to sort of dive into the ongoing tensions in this situation between Japan and China and really explore how this situation started, what are the effects of this tension between Japan and China, and where do we go from here really. Now this has all started because of some comments that Sanae Takaichi made about Taiwan, which seems to have particularly offended China. But before going into that, I sort of want to look at the background of this. I suppose things have really escalated in terms of speculation and sort of anxiety that China may make a military or a direct move towards Taiwan and take action against it. And that's escalated essentially very much recently since the Ukraine invasion. I suppose because that sort of really shattered the narrative that these sort of major invasions for land acquisition in sort of the modern age can't happen. And in essence, nothing's really stopped. Despite all the economic sanctions placed against Russia, nothing's actually stopped them doing it. And the sort of the speculation that China might look to make a similar move against Taiwan has increased since. But I suppose you could really go all the way back to sort of the Chinese Civil War and the foundation of Taiwan from sort of the losing side and what was left of the Republic of China. Really, you could sort of say this sort of speculation about military moves against Taiwan has been going since then, really. Now, when Sanae Takaichi first became the leader of Japan and the latest prime minister, I suppose there might have been concerns from China that sort of as, sort of more of a right-wing populist than Japan has seen in recent years, what that would mean for them, what her stance on Taiwan might be. Nonetheless, despite that, they had their first meeting between the leaders of China and Japan, Xi Jinping, in late October of this year. They had sort of a brief meeting, I think sort of about half an hour, and there was no major incident from that really. I mean, it was a brief meeting and there was a lot of talk about a sort of a mutually beneficial relationship, and so sort of that fact that they were able to have a meeting, nothing went wrong, there was no tension from that really. That might have maybe settled fears about possible Chinese-Japanese tensions. But that was before Sanae Takaichi in Parliament made these recent comments about Taiwan. Now, what did she actually say? Well, she said that if China were to make a direct move, sort of take military action against Taiwan, Japan itself might consider that an existential threat. Now, that's particularly significant beyond the face of it, because the complicated way Japan's constitution works is that it bars Japan from having any sort of military. It's sort of they have still the original pacifist constitution given to them by the Americans in the 1940s. Despite that, and despite Japan never changing its constitution, effectively they do have a military. They have what they call a self-defense force. But sort of over time, without actually rewriting their constitution, they've sort of upgraded the understanding of their military, where it's something they can use for self-defense. They might even use it potentially for self-defense in a situation where another nearby country or an allied country is being attacked. If they consider it a threat to Japan itself by extension, that's something that is sort of has been mooted as a possibility, sort of despite the legal implications of the fact that Japan, as I say, has never changed their constitution strictly from a pacifist one. So to say that it might be an existential threat for Japan if China took direct military action against Taiwan, you're sort of, by implication, saying you might be in a situation legally where you could get involved and look to defend Taiwan and take military action against China. So that has been seen by many within China as being quite provocative. In the immediate aftermath, there's been condemnation by China of that statement, and also was one particularly strong incident where a Chinese diplomat, a consul general stationed in Osaka, said some very sort of violent and threatening things towards Sanae Takaichi afterwards, before deleting the comments. So it sort of seems to have provoked quite a strong reaction, really. So what's been sort of the material effects, the direct reaction to these comments by Sanae Takaichi? Well, immediately, sort of China said that in the wake of this sort of, I suppose you'd say, degrading of people-to-people relations, of talks between China and Japan, this sort of environment that's happened as the result of these comments, and sort of China denouncing it, they've now sort of warned Chinese citizens that it's not as safe to travel to Japan. They've issued sort of a travel advisory, you'd say, to their citizens. Now, on the back of that, beyond simply encouraging, or you could say by that warning, citizens to not go, or sort of saying at the very least that it's not safe for them to go, Chinese airlines, as a result, began offering refunds to any Chinese citizens who'd already bought tickets and planned travel to Japan. So that's directly hitting sort of the tourist industry, you could say, if this sort of is to continue. Now, it remains to be seen what the long-term impacts of this will be. I mean, Japan has record-breaking tourism, which is great for their economy, but it has raised concerns about over-tourism, and so many would seek to have less tourists. However, I read a Time article that estimated in the region of 500 million to 1.2 billion could be the value of Chinese tourism in Japan. So that's a big negative consequence in the long term if this isn't resolved. And as I say, we'll have to wait to see what the impact on what currently is a record-breaking amount of tourism in Japan will be, and whether it sort of is dampened by this, or if record-breaking tourism continues to happen in Japan. It'd be very interesting what the direct result of that will be. There's also, in terms of an economic impact, there's concerns for the Japanese film industry. There's been reports that Japanese films, animes in particular, which are planned to be screened in China, they're now being delayed as a result. And so the Japanese film industry, obviously a major industry, it's a big cultural export for Japan. And so if that is to continue, and Japanese export of sort of media and film is harmed, obviously it harms that particular industry in the long run. So we'll have to see if that continues. Not so much an economic impact, and more of a symbolic thing, is there's been also speculation that Japan only has 2 pandas at the moment. Now, these are sort of a very symbolic animal closely associated with China, and indeed China sort of closely monitors who it leases out and loans out these pandas to, and it's even been dubbed panda diplomacy, that sort of China will only permit them to be sent to countries they directly approve of and or at least have working relations with. Well, the current lease, I believe, in a Tokyo zoo of the only 2 pandas that Japan has is due to expire next year. So there's speculation that given the sort of the current tension, they could be recalled, which, although obviously not a big economic impact, it's sort of a big symbolic moment, you'd say, if Japan were to lose its only pandas. And then, of course, there's the Senkaku Islands, which are sort of a disputed island territory and sort of in waters between Japan and China. They've already deployed the Chinese, I believe, the Coast Guard there, in sort of making a symbolic statement of we're going to retaliate by sort of being deploying a Coast Guard asset there, and that's sort of maybe seen as quite provocative, really, towards Japan as a result of this. Another instance of sort of retaliation, you could say, is that there's been remarks coming from China or Chinese officials and Chinese citizens regarding Okinawa. And now Okinawa is a sort of an island off the coast of Japan, and they've sort of implied that maybe Okinawa shouldn't be part of Japanese territory, or that the Okinawans are being sort of mistreated by Japan. Now that's sort of, if you know anything about the sort of the history of Okinawa and sort of maybe the sort of quite difficult times that the Okinawans have been through in their recent history, that's sort of a little bit of a sensitive subject to sort of to bring up, and it's sort of maybe hitting Japan where it hurts in terms of a sort of an awkward thing to bring up by implying that about Okinawa. And I suppose you'd maybe see that as sort of a response in the sense that conversation about Taiwan is a very uncomfortable topic, you would say, broadly for the Chinese government. I mean, for instance, they even discussing of Taiwan, and to say it's a separate country is seen as controversial and contravenes the sort of the one China policy that China strongly believes in and advocates for. So there's sort of maybe an argument they're sort of doing a similar thing in sort of talking about a politically sensitive topic and the extension of Japan in that way. In terms of an internal reaction to this incident, the predecessor to Sanae Takaichi, the previous Prime Minister of Japan from her same party, Shigeru Ishiba, was asked about this in an interview, and you could say he maybe sort of broke a little bit with convention, although it's not entirely unprecedented, in sort of criticising her directly, as I believe on 1 or 2 occasions previous Japan Prime Ministers have criticised the sitting Prime Minister. But in any case, he said that if words to the effect that she maybe could due to be more cautious about this, and that she shouldn't just be saying such things, and should maybe, you know, watch her words a little bit more and be a bit more cautious, was the sort of the thrust of what he said in that interview. Despite that, though, and despite all these immediate consequences from China, it doesn't seem to have necessarily started hurting Sanae Takaichi's popularity yet. Now, Sanae Takaichi, of course, she's very early on in her time as Prime Minister of Japan, but she's enjoyed some quite good poll ratings. I saw one-off poll that I believe was high as 82%, which is pretty incredible, given broadly what her predecessor Shigeru Ishiba was getting. But she early on was in sort of the 60s and the 70s more generally. However, recently, since this sort of Taiwan and China incident and these tensions, I believe one poll put her in sort of the high 60s, above 69, something like 69.9%, and a recent poll put her at 72%. So if there is going to be a sort of a fall in popularity as a result of these China tensions, it's not yet emerging in polls. And in fact, it's interesting to speculate what the Venn diagram or what the overlap is between those who maybe like this sort of tough talk towards China and those who approve of Sanae Takaichi, or if it's just, unrelated, maybe they just broadly support Sanae Takaichi, these 60 or 70% or so of the Japanese population that are coming out for her in polls. And perhaps it's just entirely unrelated to this, and the issue hasn't quite cut through to the Japanese public. But it's interesting to see where this will go in the long term and if there'll be any sort of impact. But certainly at the moment, you're not seeing any sort of noticeable decrease in her popularity coming through in poll ratings yet. Now, I should probably touch on sort of what the global reaction to this has been. An immediate neighbour is South Korea, but the president of South Korea was asked about this, and he's not really been drawn in too much. And he's effectively said he'll sort of calmly watch sort of this situation between China and Japan and sort of the rising tensions. So really not taking much of a position on it, just saying he's sort of monitoring it effectively. Now, Sanae Takaichi was recently at the G20. She wasn't able to, I believe, to get a meeting with Chinese representatives. Nonetheless, she was greeted quite warmly by some leaders, an example being Meloni, the leader of Italy. And she'll be meeting many of them given the relatively short tenure she has so far, so she'll be meeting many of them for the first time. So she doesn't seem to be particularly at the moment, based on the meeting alone, diplomatically isolated from what I can see. Like, as I say, she had a few first meetings at the UN, despite perhaps arguably debatably the disappointment of not being able to sort of address this and put this to bed early. Now, Trump's reaction to this is very interesting, and it's interesting to speculate about, because of course it's thought that Trump and Sanae Takaichi are sort of natural allies. There was a lot of speculation about that. The two were sort of very politically aligned, and of course she's from the Abe faction, and Shinzo Abe is someone who Trump still warmly talks about and who he had a very close relationship with, he was friends with, and he still talks about him fondly, as I say. So it was thought that when these first two meet, that the meeting went over very well. He had a lot of complimentary things to say about her, and it was thought that these two would be sort of natural allies. Now, he's called her off the back of talking to the leader of China, and he's not really disclosed what he said, Trump. But as I say, on the back of speaking to the leader of China, he made this phone call to Sanae Takaichi, and it'd be very interesting to know what he said, but really that's not been disclosed. So at the very least, he's not publicly come out and taken a stance from what I can see on this. And arguably the biggest follow-up that people are watching is sort of Sanae Takaichi. Now, the thing that China would really want her to do is sort of back down and retract her comments, even apologise, you would say, for what she said about Taiwan. Now, she hasn't done that. She hasn't effectively retracted what she said. She did, however, you could say, expand or clarify, in the sense that she said, I did state a number of possible scenarios, and I also said the government will make a comprehensive judgment on whether the situation constitutes a survival-threatening situation, is the quote. So I suppose she's saying there is that the government of the day will make a judgment whether it's an existential threat. It won't necessarily automatically be an existential threat if China would take military action against Taiwan, is I suppose what you could read into that. That's my interpretation of that, but that might not necessarily be right. So she's sort of expanded on her comments, but she's not retracted them, she's not apologised, which is probably what China would want to do, and say that Japan definitively would not consider it a existential threat and would not intervene. That's probably what China would really want to hear. Which sort of begs the question of where do we go from here, really. It's hard to see how this ends cleanly without one side or the other backing down. Either China saying that they no longer want to pursue this sort of thing against Japan and they'll effectively let the comments go, or Sanae Takaichi having to retract her comments or even apologise to sort of pacify China. I suppose something that could happen, and perhaps maybe Sanae Takaichi was hoping they could meet at the UN for this reason, although that's me just speculating that she wanted to, is perhaps if the Chinese leader Xi Jinping and Sanae Takaichi got together in a private meeting and then they simply said something like, oh, we've come to an understanding now and it's in the past. That sort of maybe gives a situation where you can say, oh, they've come to an understanding, but both leaders can save face in that neither one is necessarily backing down. You can sort of speculate what was said in private in that way and what was said without the cameras and the world watching to come to that sort of new understanding and agreement without either side having to publicly back down. You could sort of speculate what was said in private to sort of give the headspace for both leaders to sort of back down and stop this escalation. Perhaps that's how this will end in the end, or it will just peter out over time. Maybe one side will do something for the other that sort of gives them the ability to back down, but we'll just have to wait and see in that respect. It's quite possible, and there's been speculation about this, that there could be a further escalations. Perhaps China doesn't list this travel advisory, which means that Chinese tourists continue to not be as willing to go to Japan and travel there, which could hit China economically, and perhaps there could even be an escalation. And this has been speculated about, I believe, that maybe Japan's supply chains and sort of supply lines could be hurt by Chinese businesses being more reluctant, sort of pulling supplies from them, not being as willing to do business with them. Maybe that could hit Japan's bottom line and push them into a situation where they really have to, sort of go to China and look to resolve this. And perhaps there'll be more symbolic gestures. Like I say, there's already been speculation about the pandas being withdrawn next year. Or there could be more sort of manoeuvring of Chinese military assets in Japanese waters or disputed territory, or sort of more boycotts and call for, like I say, Chinese industries to hurt Japan could be the next step, as well as these sort of symbolic gestures that sort of undermine Japan. Who knows, perhaps Japan will even get into the game and look to take some sort of action against China, but that's my pure speculation as a possibility of something that could happen. I'm not really predicting that. It just remains to be seen really how this will develop, whether it'll escalate or slowly peter out, or there'll be some sort of resolution. But as I say, it could be quite difficult to manage this without some sort of loss of face coming from either side. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how that evolves over the coming weeks and months, and whether this can be brought to a neat end or not, or if it will just continue. But yeah, we'll just have to monitor that over the coming weeks and months, like I say, and see what happens from there. Thank you so much for listening, guys. That's my attempt to sort of summarise this sort of China-Japan situation and the tensions relating over these Taiwan comments. But thank you so much for listening. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. Sayonara, goodbye.